Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the top 10 things that drive law firm and corporate legal automation specialists crazy and what you can learn from them. Today's webinar is hosted by Black Hills IP and the SLW Institute. It will be moderated by Anne McCracken, and Anne is going to introduce the rest of the panelists. Good afternoon, Anne.
Thank you, Justin. As Justin said, I'm Anne McCracken. I'm a patent attorney and the president of Black Hills IP. Our panelists include Steve Lundberg, Principal and Chief Innovation Officer at Schwegman Lundberg Wussner, Jill Young, Automation Specialist at Black Hills IP, Doug Knutson, Senior .NET Architect and Developer at Black Hills IP, and Chris Kinneberg, IP Software Developer at Black Hills IP. Thank you all for being a part of this program today. I appreciate your participation. Justin, can we go to the next slide? Developing legal tech software can be complex and it can take a long time. Things are not always as easy as they may look to the legal professionals who are working with the software developers. Most law firms and corporate legal departments are not used to developing software from scratch. Instead, they're used to buying packages off the shelf that are designed for specific legal applications already. However, we're seeing trends where some law firms, larger law firms in particular, are starting to set up teams to develop their own software tools. Others are working with outside vendors to create custom software. All this is driven by the fact that everybody is recognizing that automation is going to be key to profitability and productivity in the legal space. But problems can arise. For example, if law firms fail to describe their expectations for the software that they want to have developed, or on the other side, if developers fail to communicate the complexity and what needs to be done to complete a particular project. Because our focus at Black Hills IP is on automating IP docketing and paralegal tasks, we've dealt with a lot of these problems. You could probably even say we've seen just about all of it. So today, we've gathered this panel together along with Steve Lundberg from Schwegman to share tips to make the software development process easier. So let's get started. We have included a list of what we call the top 10 crazy makers for legal automation specialists. And we're going to talk about who's responsible for these things, what causes the problem, and share ideas and tips for coping with these problems. So the first one is too many projects at once with moving priorities, ever-changing requirements once a project has started. Chris, can you lead us off with this one?
Definitely. So the thing about these two issues of having too many projects and projects with ever-changing requirements is that it's possible to get into this state where nothing is ever actually getting done, but there's more and more work that is to be done. So what can happen with not thinking too specifically about what projects you're assigning and what those projects requirements are at the start is you end up having a great idea for a thing that you can automate in the legal space. And you start working on that and a developer might estimate that it'll take 2 weeks. And a week and a half into that project, you might get another brilliant idea. And it might be more valuable than your first idea. So you say, let's put that second one on hold and let's work on this for a week and a half. And if that ever happens more than 3 or 4 times in a row, you're left with these orphan projects that just never get finished. And by the time that you start working on them again, they might have completely different requirements. And that's something that we've dealt with a few times in the past, and it's something that we're always trying to work to get better on. A couple of the ways we've dealt with that in the past has been trying to look at what projects we have open and what projects we might have coming down the pipeline, and really thinking about how we can merge those projects or how we can build code and build automation systems that can be useful for multiple projects, so we aren't reinventing the wheel with each one of them. And the second piece is just once you're coming back to a project, or once you're getting started on a project that might have been proposed months ago, you want to make sure that that project is still relevant. and make sure that there hasn't been an event that's made the project unimportant at this point or have less value than it did in the past.
Those are good tips. Thanks, Chris.
You bet.
Let's go to the second one. The second crazy maker is unrealistic timeframes for project completion. Jill, can you lead us off on this one?
Sure. Let me start by saying that there's many different ways that projects are presented and manufactured, and they come from all different sources. They can come from management, they can come from end users that are using the system. They can be inspired internally from the development team. So there's many different ways that that projects get presented for new development, for enhancements to existing systems. So to start out with, often there are brainstorming sessions, or what I call brain dumps, that are useful, but unless we capture the essence of a starting and ending point within that, sometimes that's where some of these unrealistic expectations spring from, because we take a whole without breaking it up into parts. And so from those brainstorming sessions, what we would hope to come out of that is clear documented specifications that can be captured in those brainstorming sessions and then brought back to the group for consensus and agreement that this is what the beginning would look like, these would be some of our milestones along the way, and then this is what the end outcome would look like. And throughout that entire process, what needs to happen is, as we reach those milestones, there always has to be check-in points and make sure we're all on the same track, that we haven't veered off on some tangent, either by new information coming in or by a developer thinking they understood something that they didn't understand clearly. So demos are very effective to do along the way, so that we can be sure we stay on the same track to completion. Also, from a brainstorming session, if the scope becomes too large, that's your opportunity there to break it into components, and maybe it becomes 2 or 3 different phases rather than one gigantic undertaking all at once. And so the trigger words that I watch out for, especially when you're in a brainstorming session, is this shouldn't be too big of a project, or this shouldn't take too long, or can we just add? Those are all things to kind of be aware of as they pop up in the development cycle that might be keys to coming back to the table and getting back on track.
Those are great words to watch out for, Jill. Does anybody else have something they'd like to add on this one?
Yeah, and I think Joe covered it really well. And I would just like to second on the projects, when starting out with a project and kind of in those initial meetings and coming up with an initial plan, a lot of the details typically will not come out until later. And that's when you find the complexity growing, the scope growing, and really re-evaluating maybe how to chunk it into smaller pieces that are easy to manage and easier for people to digest, and re-evaluate maybe where your targets are, because as you get into a project, as Jill stated, it's going to change, and going into the process, knowing that it's going to change and that change is good is not a bad thing, and you shouldn't try to avoid it. You just need to plan for it.
Great. Thanks, Doug. All right, let's go to the next one. Number 3 is short-term project objectives that don't fit future requirements. Doug, can you talk on this one as well?
Sure. So it's easy to jump out always on the current crisis of the day, or the current item that maybe is suggested as a potential project. But I think it's always good to think about what is the long-term goals and to keep that in mind. And we've kind of already talked about that a little bit with the first two items on our list. And I think it's just something always that you want to keep in mind, that as you're working on kind of your automation processes, this is going to be an ever evolving kind of entity. And you just don't want to try to solve today's issues, but you want to think more long term. And how are maybe your short-term projects going to fit into a bigger picture of what you're trying to accomplish? And you might even view it as what's kind of our strategic vision of where we want to take our automation. And I think it's also important to keep in mind, though, as you go through this process, to remember to always keep your immediate targets and your immediate milestones in easily managed chunks so that you don't lose that overall vision.
Good. I just realized I forgot to mention in the beginning that there is a Q&A box for the audience to submit questions. And if you have questions as we go, please go ahead and type your question in. We'll be watching for those and we'll take those questions as we go as well. Okay, let's go on to number 4. So this one is prototype systems that graduate to production systems. Doug, can I have you take this one as well?
Yeah, sure. So prototype systems, which also might be sometimes referred to as a proof of concept. So a lot of times when you're starting out with maybe a new process or a new project, you want to identify and maybe try a few things out because you're not quite sure how things are going to work, maybe how you're going to interface with another system, with another vendor. So you want to go through a shorter process of a prototype or proof of concept to kind of verify that, yes, this is what we want to do and we're on the right track. The problem that can occur and is very easy to happen is that prototype system starts to work and keeps evolving to the point where it starts being used as a production system. However, it was maybe never intended to be an actual production type system that you're depending on and is running critical processing. So this can lead to some issues later on that you may not be thinking of right away as far as the effort, the cost, and the efficiency of supporting and maintaining and continuing to enhance that product. Because it's very likely that the development of that prototype or proof of concept was done as what I would call kind of a quick and dirty to kind of prove a point or to test out a theory. So a couple of things that we always try to do, because this is a real useful tool of having a prototype, is to try to determine upfront what stage do we want to take this to? What is the goal of this prototype system or this proof of concept? And when we get to that stage or that milestone, that we really take a critical look and say, okay, now we have a better idea what we really want to do and how we really want it to work. Do we want to stop at this point, redesign it or rework it so that it does the functionality we're looking for, and build it with it being a production system in mind so that it's easier to maintain, better documented, easier to support, and you've done checked all the boxes that you normally would, that you might not do with a prototype or proof of concept. The other thing I did want to mention regarding this is testing. A lot of times with prototypes or proof of concept, you may not be running it through vigorous testing that you would typically do with a production system. And that may get forgotten. And you get to the point where it's like, hey, this is working great. We're ready to go. Let's throw it out there and start using it. All of a sudden you start having different problems because it's not really designed to handle situations where, you know, a file doesn't have the right information in it, or a system is down, or if it has a UI interface, somebody's entering in information that's not correct and you're not properly validating it, because you're probably not going to build that into a prototype or proof of concept. So it can really become kind of a support issue. And it can be very costly sometimes to go back and try to fix that stuff if it's done in kind of a quick fashion just to get something up and running.
So early planning is important with respect to when and how a prototype system might eventually become a production system. Is that what I'm hearing, Doug?
Yep, I think just the understanding of the team working on the project, that the idea would be that this is a short-lived piece of software. And here's, you know, and a little advanced planning on here's what we want to accomplish with this. We want to verify that we can communicate with this system over here, or read in this file and do some processing, whatever the case might be. Once we get to that point and prove that point, then we want to reevaluate, okay, now we maybe want to start over from a standpoint of, now let's write a system that has all the proper tests, is written the right way, has the proper validation processes built into it, and try to do that early enough so that you're not so far down the road that it's like going to be too costly to rework that prototype system. Because that's typically what happens if you don't plan it, is you get to a point where it's like, now we got this great prototype system. It really works pretty well. We know there's a few problems, and the ability or the need to maybe rewrite it's going to seem to be like, we don't really need to do it. But I think you end up paying for it in the future, staying with that model versus, so it just becomes a lot easier, kind of plan for it, keep your prototype stage as short as possible, or your proof of concept stage as short as possible, with the idea that it's a throwaway.
Mm-hmm. Do any other panelists have comments on this one?
Sorry about that. I do. I've got an example about what Doug's talking about there, which is just a situation I got into where we had a prototype system that had graduated to production without a lot of consideration, and it had been in production for about 6 months to 8 months, and we built a lot of tooling around the system. But we realized that each new feature we wanted to add to the prototype was becoming more and more unwieldy, because really it was meant as a prototype. And so there were some code standards and some changes that we would have made had we been thinking about it as a production system from the start. And what ended up happening was it was just untenable to keep on improving it in its current state. So we ended up having to actually just take it aside and keep it running for about a month and a half while we did a complete rewrite of the system, which was far more complicated than had we just taken some time 6 months earlier and just said, this is a good prototype, let's redo this. And one of the reasons we needed to do that was just because there was all these other tools that weren't just prototypes, that were really working well with the system, but the system itself was too fragile for us. And so to take a system that already exists and kind of treat it like a black box where you say, I'm going to get the same inputs as you and I'm going to give the same outputs as you, but I'm going to do it in an efficient way, was pretty complicated, because if we got anything wrong, we would be degrading the quality of our systems, which is not what we want to do either. And it was a lot of work for what is essentially just a strategy issue early on that I think you can really learn from, to just say, if we've got a prototype, there really is value in thinking about how we're going to use this long term and whether or not it's going to be feasible to use it as use it in production or not.
It's a good example, Chris. Let's move on to number 5. The number 5 crazy maker on our list is disparate systems without proper interfaces creating fragile workflows. Doug, I'm going to turn to you again. Can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, sure, Ann. So a lot of times dealing with different IP automation processes and projects, you're probably working with several different types of systems, applications, solutions. This might include other vendor systems such as docketing systems, might include other internal applications that you're using, software that might be developed already in-house, that might just be simply spreadsheets where you're keeping track of certain information. And there's a lot of things to keep in mind with this as you start to think about how you're going to integrate data information processing between these different systems. So some systems, particularly like docketing systems, do provide what are called APIs, application programming interfaces. And these are typically designed specifically for what you want to do. You want to develop software, you want to use information out of that application in your software. They're designed and they work typically very well depending on the vendor. Other systems don't have APIs, so you have to resort to pulling data from that system, and there might be several different ways you do that. One common way for like a docketing system might be to generate some reports of the information you need if that system supports customers' reports, especially, so that you can pull the data you need into your system. Generally, that works pretty well, especially if you can customize the reports so that you're getting just the data you need and also all of the data that you need. Some other systems don't really have either way available to you, and they might be web-based systems. So you have to develop other ways to kind of extract the information. Some systems like the USPTO, you kind of have to do all of the above. They do have some APIs and for a lot of their information, but they also don't have APIs for a lot of their information. So if you want to automate things with the PTO, you might have to do and gather data a couple different methods. All of these things wrapped together, can give you kind of a fragile workflow from a standpoint of you've got a lot of points for failure, especially if you're combining a few of these together in your final solution or in your application or in your workflows. So there's a few things that I think that we've found because we deal with a lot of different docketing systems. We deal with a lot of different types of inputs of files for different purposes, of documents that need to be used by the Black Hills Services teams. And we always look for APIs as our first option. If there's an API available, we will try to leverage that because we know that that's going to give us the most stable connection. And most vendors are pretty good with keeping an API stable such that when there's updates to the software, they're always making enhancements and things. Some vendors are very good at keeping that API stable because updates can happen anytime. And if they change their API, then it's going to potentially stop your ability to use that API until you update your software, which which may lead to some downtime. But generally, APIs are going to be your best option. Using some other type of custom reporting is also not a bad option, especially if you have control over those reports such that they're not standard reports, because those could change when a vendor updates a system. And the other thing I just really wanted to kind of point out with this that makes integrating systems difficult in all cases, and this depends on the vendor, and it's just something to plan for and be aware of, is the fact that a lot of vendors are not thinking about what you're using their system for. So they may modify things, they may change how things work. You may not necessarily know that up front. One day, all of a sudden, it just works differently or doesn't work at all. So you want to try to be prepared for that. And I think APIs can help avoid a lot of that pain, but it is something to always think about when you're trying to put all these systems together and integrate them to try to minimize problems on your end.
Doug, you mentioned programming. Well, you mentioned the USPTO and APIs for some things, but not other things. Jill, I know you've got a lot of experience working with interfacing with the USPTO. Can you add some comments?
Sure. Doug gave a good example of that being a vehicle that we need to probably access in several different modes. One of those required, as we all remember, we used to log into the PTO with a pair key, a certificate that resided on a desktop. And that was actually a way that we leveraged to be able to log into the PTO and gather the necessary information through actually mimicking going through their interface. And so what happened in that instance, and this is just an example of some of the things that you have to be aware of when you're integrating, is they changed in a relatively short period of time the way that you logged into the PTO into private pair. And that went from a pair key that resided on a desktop to everybody having to create and receive from the PTO a login credential actually that was associated with an email. And so that, and it also introduced two-factor authentication. So that was an entirely different way of gaining access to the system to get some of the information that we needed in the form of the daily correspondence and the PDF files. And so I think their original timeline for deprecating the pair keys was about a 6 weeks time frame, which now you can imagine what kind of upset that creates. You've got all these other projects going on and this now interjects itself. So that is a whole new thing that you have to come in and address. And at that point it becomes the top priority. So that's just something that needs to be aware. As the PTO did extend their deadline for that, because I think they saw a lot of issues that evolved around it. But it's just a prime example of all hands had to be on deck for something that was totally unexpected because of the integration. And when it's a business critical process like that, there's no putting it on the back burner. It has to be addressed immediately.
Yeah, that was a serious situation. That's a good example, Jill. So it may not always be in your control whether a system has an API or not, but when it does, developing to the API is going to be a way to develop stronger interfaces, more reliable interfaces is what I'm hearing. And if it's not an API, look to build the strongest interface that you have available, because that's critical on your workflows. Let's go to number 6. Number 6 on our list is the lack of knowledge of the resources necessary for ongoing operations and support of these production systems. Chris, can you take this one?
Definitely. So one of the things that you need to be aware of whenever you're creating a new system or a new project that's going to be an ongoing project is that even after the developer's written their final line of code and it started to work, you need to be aware that it takes someone to maintain a project. And maintaining a project can take a variety of different forms. It can mean fixing bugs that may exist in the project. It can mean making small improvements or tweaks or adding additional features, but it can also involve things like what we were just talking about. If a system changes that's external and out of your control, you're going to need to do some maintenance to it. And those can happen for basically any system that exists. One of the things that I've become aware of with working with legal software in particular is even when you've got an API that is going to be fairly consistent and is working well, you still run into a situation where an API can be deprecated. And essentially what that means is that API is going to be changed in the near future or in the future to work slightly differently. And so in a lot of software, what a deprecation notice looks like is you find out that the API that you're using is going to change. Maybe you find out a year ahead of time or months ahead of time. And then you spend some time rewriting a little bit of code to work with the new API, and then everything works. Unfortunately, with a lot of legal software, you end up with APIs that get deprecated maybe a week or even the day before their changes go live. And what that means is it's basically all hands on deck one day to say, we need to rewrite how this API works because we found out about it when it stopped working. And so just being aware of the maintenance costs and the maintenance issues that you can run into with APIs, and especially with things that aren't APIs. So if you're scraping a website for data and that website changes, you need to go and rewrite how you're scraping things so that you make sure that it's still working. And there's just always ongoing processes that require somebody to be working on them. So it always takes some people to keep the plate spinning.
Yes, and this is the thing that non-developers often fail to realize and plan for. So the legal professionals involved aren't thinking about the ongoing support, but they need to. And the tip here, it sounds like, is that they should be budgeting for and allocating resources for ongoing support of these systems, and not just for the initial development and implementation phases.
Definitely.
Let's go to number 7. Number 7 on our list is processes that have outgrown solutions. Doug, can you take this one?
Yeah, so this kind of deals a lot with some of the other things that we've talked about, including like a prototype process. But it can be even something that you feel like, hey, we properly designed this, planned this out, but at the time it was developed, you maybe didn't know where it was really going to end up a couple years down the road, or maybe even a year down the road or less. And one thing that we find a lot in software development is things can increase in the amount of capacity they're asked to process very quickly. We find lots of examples in our work where, and I think Chris has mentioned this too as well a couple times, where we have a process set up and it's designed to handle a certain amount of transactions or workflow going through it. A few months later, it's doubled or tripled in size. Sometimes that even happens literally overnight. And sometimes the development teams are not always aware of some of these changes because it might be due to something in the business or some type of new product that you're going to support, or you know, a customer has a big influx of processing that they need to handle and run through your whatever feature it might happen to be. So this is a constant thing, and sometimes it's kind of hard to plan for, but it's always good to think about, especially in the early stages, of if we need to increase the capacity of this process down the road, are there some things we can do up front to make that job easier? We're maybe not going to do it today because it's not worth the time or effort, and frankly, maybe it's a new process and we're not sure if it's going to take off or not. But doing a little bit of advanced planning, thinking ahead to if the volume doubled, tripled, 10 times what we're expecting to initially do, would we be able to handle that? Or what types of changes might we need to do to handle that? Can we do some things today to make that transition a lot easier? And this is commonly, again, can happen a lot when taking that prototype proof of concept and it just all of a sudden spins into a production mode. And then maybe you started processing a limited set of data through the system, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, this is working great, and someone up top says, hey, let's go live, I've got somebody, we can start using this tomorrow, and blah blah blah, and pretty soon you're running tons of stuff through this system that was never designed to do it because it was a proof of concept, and plus it was never designed to run that type of volume. So it's something to always keep in mind and bring up for discussion if you see some of those warning signs of taking prototypes to production or not thinking about the future and how this product may escalate and be used.
Good. Jill, do you have any additional comments on
Yes.
this one?
Yes, I actually have a prime example of something like this, where we had a process that took docket items from a docketing system, from a management system, and added them to attorney Outlook tasks. And it worked for many years flawlessly for the most part. And then we moved our mailboxes to the cloud. And in the testing phase of it, and this process, it was an overnight process that was automated and ran on its own. And it probably would take 1 to 2 hours to pull all of it through. And in the testing phase of moving the mailboxes to the cloud, it worked just fine, just as would be expected. Taking the small set for testing, everything was going through fine. Went into production, and what was a 1 to 2 hour process started taking 6 to 8 hours. So that's a very good example of what Doug was just laying out here, is the volume anticipation for the testing phase didn't adequately address what issues might come up in the production phase. So actually it required going back and revisiting how things were running and what errors might be encountered along the way. So that's just an example of things to be aware of, and the testing doesn't always prove out what's going to happen in production either. So you have to be aware of that and make adjustments along the way.
Wow. Chris, do you have any examples?
Yeah, so I wanted to take this from kind of a different angle, because sometimes it's easy to say, if you're telling me that if volume increases, we're going to need to do more development work, it's sometimes easy to say, well, if we've got more volume, that probably means we're doing well and we're saving more time or saving more money by doing this automation, so we can justify this additional work. But one of the issues we ran into was with a rules system that takes rules and uses those rules to define how we process incoming emails. And as that system grew, we started adding more and more rules. And we got to the point where we had maybe 10 or 15,000 rules. And by adding more rules, we might have been automating some more documents, but we weren't automating 15,000 times more rules. And we built a prototype for only, let's say, 500 rules. And by increasing those rules, we're increasing what the workload of the system, but we aren't necessarily or fundamentally increasing its throughput or increasing its productivity. Now, we are improving things by increasing those rules, but it's worth thinking about the things that can, the numbers that can go up related to your system that might not necessarily just be how many items it's processing, but what other kinds of work it has to do. Because those are the times where you can really kind of say to yourself, in this prototype, it works great, but we aren't actually doing as much as we'd like to. And so being aware of those other numbers, like the number of rules that you've got, or the number of, I'm not sure. Those are things to think about that can kind of get you as you move out of the prototype and into the real systems phase.
Yeah, that's a good insight, Chris. Let's go to number 8. Number 8 on our list is the disruption of processes due to reliance on outside vendors or interconnected systems. Doug, can you speak to this one?
Yeah, sure. So we've kind of discussed some of this in some, I think, of the previous topics, in that when we're working with other vendors or interconnected systems, whether it's an API connection, reports, or maybe just some files from a spreadsheet that someone in the office developed to kind of help with a process. Systems change, and this is just a fact of you know, the whole IT environment is things are changing faster and faster every day. So this is definitely something that you're going to have to deal with when you're dealing with systems that you may not have direct control over, or you may have some control over, or you just want to enhance a different application, spreadsheet or something that's being used internally. And now, but before that can be used, you're going to have to modify your software. So what can you do about this? Well, if it's an API, as I mentioned before, some vendors are pretty good with notifying you of changes. And like Chris has mentioned, when they deprecate things such that they're basically telling you, we're going to take away this functionality at some point in the future. You want to stop using it and start using something over here. The best advice we can give on that is take them at their word and plan to do and switch over and stop using the functionality that they plan on taking out, so you don't have a 0-day failure when they actually do remove that from the product. Some vendors are not so good at giving you insights into changes, so you have to more kind of roll with the punches on that. And we've mentioned a few examples of that. That's a little harder to plan for, but it is something to be aware of. How might you deal with that though? One thing we always have found very useful and build into our systems is a pretty robust monitoring system and validation system. Whereas any types of outside information that we're bringing into any of our systems, part of our operational production plan is to adequately handle changes either in an API report or however we're connecting to another system, and monitor that via the appropriate means, which might mean, in the case of like loading in data from a file, it might be checking the file format, making sure we have the right information. If we don't, stick the file off to the side, and then, all important, notify someone that there was a problem, so that someone then can take a look at it and decide if it's just a bad file or if there's actually a change that needs to be addressed in the process to be able to load that file. So the whole monitoring and validation of all your connections to different systems is an important thing to think about. And the more systems you're connecting to, the more important this becomes. Because one little problem that you're not addressing because you don't know what's happening, because you aren't monitoring a particular connection to a system through an API, and maybe it's generating errors. And it's a back-end process. So if no one's really keeping an eye on it, no one's getting notified, you're going to run into problems. It might be a week or two or more before you realize that, hey, we're not getting fresh data from this system because this thing broke a while back. So planning, my advice is planning that ahead of time, whether it's logging, notifications are a good idea so that people know, hey, there's a problem, you need to go research it. These are all ideas and advice I would give to trying to minimize these disruptions that are going to happen. And you need to understand that they will happen with different systems. So you need to take some proactive measures so that when they do happen, you can adequately respond to them as timely as possible.
Good, thanks, Doug. Let's go on to number 9. Number 9 on our list is inadequate and or less than thorough testing prior to releasing a system into a production environment. Jill, can you talk about this?
Sure. So I'll start out with a question that was asked me in an interview once for a developer. And I was asked if I wrote bug-free software. And a little bit hesitantly, I said, eventually. And this is actually the precursor here to why we do testing. It really is the glue of successful deployment of a system initially or any enhancements that follow. Why it gets shortchanged often is because we're rushing to get something into production because we're either delayed on the date that we said it would be available, finding adequate testers to fulfill all of the various holes that we're looking to fill is another issue that we often encounter. And so what happens sometimes is the testing becomes ad hoc and not really fully documented use cases that are really the most thorough way to test. And there's different types of testing that occur. And if we're just doing, if all that's being tested is the development testing, then I can guarantee you're going to be putting bugs into production, because the developer tests what they know they wrote, and they try and test for as many different scenarios of how that might be used. But at the end of the day, they aren't the end user, and they can't always mimic what the end user is going to do once they have that new feature. So there's really, the buckets of testing are really, the developer obviously has to test it, make sure it's ready to at least be released to an end user to take a look at. There's, when new features are added to a system, the regression testing needs to also take place, because what your new development may be impacting may be introducing bugs into previously developed pieces of the system. So that has to take place too. And then it has to be delivered to the end user for rigorous testing. That is often probably the most difficult hurdle in the process, because they're under time constraints because they have their own job to do. And unless you have a dedicated end user that's their specific purpose, it's hard to find the end user to fit that into their schedule. So even though it's difficult, it's necessary. And the reason for the thorough testing is once you put that system into production, the minute it goes out, now you've got multiple users hammering on it. And if all of a sudden a bug avails itself, you're going to be faced with doing emergency patchwork. There could be system downtime. And it just really amounts to frustration on everybody's part at that point. So the real key is to document your use cases. Be sure that it's been thoroughly tested at every step of the way. And that's the way that you can avoid the most frustrations at the end product.
Jill, I love the comment that testing is the glue for successful deployment. I like that.
Yeah.
Let's go to number 10. So number 10 on our list is disconnected communication between end users, business analysts, and the development team, resulting in differing expectations and or suboptimal use. Jill, can you talk on this one as well?
Sure. So there's a couple different angles of this. One is, was there adequate training to the end users for them to understand and fully utilize the features, new and or old, that are in the system? And sometimes what happens is you have kind of your power users, your expert users of the system, and as there's turnover in employees, sometimes we lose some of those experts who knew every single feature of that system, and perhaps there's not proper documentation or knowledge transfer if that person were to leave. So what we find is if someone wasn't fully aware of some of those tricks or features that weren't so obvious, they end up underutilizing the system, not using it to its optimal performance, and finding workarounds that are less than efficient. So I'll switch to this little manual process because the system didn't provide me this one last step. Well, it might have been there, but you just didn't go to the right place to do it. So that's one of the reasons why I think that we sometimes find that all the features aren't being used. Another thing is unreported bugs. I know we've all hit bugs when we've been using a system. Sometimes you can hit ignore and you get past it and you go, okay, well, that's fine. And then it doesn't crop up again for another 2 weeks. And then, oh, there it is again. Okay, ignore. And what happens is those unreported bugs can be an indication of a deeper issue. And so as they go unreported, they're maybe creating other problems in the system that you're not even aware of. So those are kind of two different angles that produce kind of the same issues when using a software product. So how can we avoid it? I think communication is huge. End user communicating back to the developer, I think sometimes they're reluctant to do that because they feel I'm too busy, they're too busy, they wouldn't have time for this, I can work around it. And that's the wrong way to approach it. Regularly scheduled meetings where some of this can be documented and brought to the group at large and discussed. Another way is observing the users as they're using the system. For a developer, that can be very eye-opening because when it's developed, we have a methodology of what we think is useful. But as you turn it over to the end user, you know, it can be as simple as something as, well, the tab order on this screen is all out of whack, or this screen is too busy, I don't even know where to start. So there's little things like that that can be brought out when observing the users, and then, like I say, in communication with them on a regular basis so that they can bring to the table those types of problems that they're having.
Thank you, Jill. That's good. And I see we have a comment. It's more of a comment than a question, but a comment in the question queue that goes to your previous number 9 discussion of testing. This person makes a great point of noting that making sure that the person doing the testing is different than the person doing the development, which I think is an excellent observation. I appreciate that comment. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to get some observations from Steve Lundberg. The Schwegman firm has embraced automation for years. So Steve, can you talk about your experiences at the Schwegman firm with software development in this context.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ann. So I'll try to boil this down because we've only got a few minutes left, and I don't want to bore people. But I think having been involved in law firm automation for a long time, I certainly have been the cause of 1 through 10 of all these problems over the years, at various different times, sometimes all 10 at once, I think. But law firm automation at the law firm level, is really, a different than it is, I think, when you're doing professional software development for a company like Black Hills IP, or should be different anyways. Black Hills IP should be certainly much more rigorous and methodical, which it is. But for law firms, you're tending to just do stuff on the fly, mainly because many times you don't have to worry as much about if something goes down. You've got people there that understand that stuff doesn't always work right. So I think what ends up happening is you take someone like a Jill Young, who's like a tremendously versatile programmer, can throw something together in a hurry and make it work. You lose sight a lot of times in law firms of that these systems are, even though you've got talented programmers that throw them together quickly, they're complicated and they need a lot of attention. And if they're not done correctly, or if you don't do more thinking ahead, you can end up doing a lot of damage. But I just think it's very difficult with the kind of budgets you have and the time frames you have in law firms to do everything the way that it really ought to be done. Mainly because you're reacting so much to the changing technology environment that it's hard to essentially keep up with it, much less plan way ahead. Because by the time you implement your plan that you've done, you've already been overtaken by changes in the underlying technology. But everything in this deck, I could just finish with this, are things that I've seen happen over and over again. I've caused them all. This is like an intervention for me, actually, this program today. And I think all of the points made were just really phenomenal. And everyone should be having these in the back of their minds at all times before they make an unreasonable demand on a programmer. So that's all I've got. Ann, do you have any final comments and we can wrap it up?
Yeah, just one. If we could go to the next slide for just a moment. There've been a number of comments in this discussion about APIs, and I just wanted to make people aware of the Open Legal API initiative. Not all legal software systems have APIs, or sometimes they have APIs, but the vendors don't make those APIs available. And as law firms and corporate legal departments continue to automate, the interoperability of these different legal systems is going to be very, very important. And that's what this Open Legal API initiative is promoting. So you can go to the website openlegalapi.com if you're interested and want to learn more. And then just wanted to thank Steve, Jill, Doug, and Chris for your time today and your comments. The slides from this program will be available on the Black Hills IP website by, I think, the end of the day today, along with an audio recording. So thank you, everybody, for joining today, and thank you to our panelists. Have a great afternoon.